We're going to start. Welcome everyone to the Anti-Asian Racism in the Pandemic webinar. Just a couple things before we get started is that this presentation is a webinar. So if you do have questions or comments for our speakers, if you can use our chat box. So if you go to the bottom of your screen, you're going to see chat. If you click on the chat box, you will need to message Rick Singh in the chat box, and he will be monitoring all the questions and comments that are coming in, and then he will forward them to me after the speakers are done speaking. The other thing is at the bottom of your screen, if you require closed captioning, it is available for this webinar. So click on closed captioning button. So it should be the second last button at the bottom of your screen, and select show subtitles, and this will enable the closed captioning function. Okay, so the two things is the chat box and your closed captioning. If you have questions or comments, send them to Rick. And if you require closed captioning, click on the closed captioning and select show subtitles. So welcome everyone. My name is Elizabeth Ha. I'm from the Ontario Federation of Labor and also OPSEU, the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. I do want to thank and mention our host organizations for putting this together. We have the Asian Canadian Labor Alliance, the Toronto and York Region Labor Council, and the Chinese Workers Network, OPSEU Provincial Human Rights Committee, and OPSEU Coalition of Racialized Workers, and the Ontario Federation of Labor Workers of Color Committee. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Mary Ann Larico, who is the co-chair of the Asian Canadian Labor Alliance, to do the statement of solidarity and recognition.
Hi, thank you, Elizabeth. My name is Mary Ann Larico, and I definitely want to thank the collaborators and organizers of this event for the opportunity to share statements of solidarity and land recognition. I want to emphasize that we as activists learning to be good allies need to move beyond land acknowledgements that are simply boxes to check off at events. And instead, we have to always be looking for ways to actually practice and put into purposeful motion meaningful acts of reconciliation. And for me, part of that has meant building a better understanding of and relationship with the often denied history of the lands and peoples that I have benefited from. I'm in Kingston, Ontario, and I recognize that the original stewards of this land where I am today, the Huron-Wendat and the Haudenosaunee, who were also the first activists, resistors, and educators, and that the Mohawk language was spoken in these trees long before English or French was. For tens of thousands of years, Indigenous people throughout Turtle Island have been managing the land, water, and wildlife, ensuring that there was enough for all and that you only took what you would use, and the rest was left to be shared amongst all. The foundation of those cultures was the leadership of elders and the legacies of ancestors, and during this time, when a light is shining on the systemic abuse of the most elderly in our society, I commit to remembering that Indigenous elders played and continue to play a pivotal role in structuring healthy communities, and that for thousands of years, elders were the keepers of knowledge and carried the responsibility of sharing and educating. And I recognize that colonialism changed all of that. There's a long and extensive history of the violent effects of colonialism on Indigenous people, Recently, there's been a public and persistent rise of activism and fighting against the ravages of colonialism. And as labor movement leaders and activists, we have to stand in solidarity with these activists and resistors. We have to understand that when we fight for one, we fight for all, and that we have a responsibility to provide education to our members, our families, and our communities to ensure that those traditions of resistance and activism are carried on. This work includes fighting for the rights of Indigenous people wherever those rights are threatened. And today we're continuing the tradition of stewardship, activism, resistance, and education. And when we do this work, we have to ensure that those traditions of resistance and activism are carried on side by side with Indigenous communities, just like the two-row wampum that existed centuries prior to the nation state we know as Canada. During these unprecedented times, I want to acknowledge the Indigenous children that were forced to attend residential schools throughout Canada and the United States, Turtle Island. These children were taken by force, tortured, beaten, and in some cases murdered. I especially want to remember the children who didn't come home from those institutions. About 100 kilometers away from me is Alderville, Ontario. It's also where the Alnwick Residential School was run by the Methodist Church in collaboration with the Canadian government from 1838 to 1966. That's 128 years. I encourage you to find out where the nearest residential school was to your community and learn about its history. In my own quest to understand and unpack the injustices of colonialism, state-entrenched capitalism, and at its root, racial and gendered injustice, I commit to becoming more aware and saying no to perpetuating the racism and anti-Indigenous sentiments entrenched in white histories that seek to erase the overt and systemic genocide of Indigenous peoples. And as I struggle to contemplate all the death in my community and the collective trauma that's unfolding before our eyes, I want to acknowledge all of the missing and murdered Indigenous women, communities burdened by the 60s scoop, and communities that still don't have access to clean drinking water, land, and basic human dignity and respect because of imperialist quests to control and conquer. And in this recognition and acknowledgement, I'm committing to saying no to anti-Indigenous, anti-Black, anti-Asian, and don't have to perpetuate any of that to get ahead. I acknowledge my own internalized racism and commit to working to challenge and change it every single day. No more bodies that can't breathe. This is my offer of solidarity and recognition. Together we shall not submit. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. So it is May, and it is what we're told is Asian Heritage Month or Asian Awareness Month. And I just want to mention that even though we're doing this in May, it's important to recognize what's happening during this pandemic and to talk about the hate crimes that are happening against people of East Asian descent, which is on the rise. We see and hear about it on social media. We experience it. Last month, there's so many stories out there right now. The young woman that was on the SkyTrain in Vancouver, where she was grabbed by her hair. They slammed her face multiple times into the seat, pushed out of the train. The 92-year-old great-grandfather who was suffering from dementia was grabbed by the shoulder. The man pushed him out of the door. He fell back, hit his head on the pavement. In the States, the family at he believed they were Chinese people infecting Americans with the coronavirus. Donald Trump referring to COVID-19 as the Chinese virus, Wuhan coronavirus, or Kung Fu, and all these things. I mean, his remarks, racist remarks, are not accidental. So even though it is May and Asian Heritage Month, these things are happening, and you know, it's just been heightened because of what's happening, and it's important that we have this discussion and what are we going to do about it. So I'm going to go through the agenda real quick and let you know who our speakers are. We have Jennifer Mack, who is a workplace human rights investigator. Tony Wong, a columnist for the Toronto Star. Justin Kong, who's the executive director for the Chinese Canadian National Council of Toronto, Toronto and York Region Labor Council, Chinese Workers Network. Elaine Lamb, the executive director, Butterfly, Asian and Migrant Sex Workers Support Network. Alain Mendoza from UFCW, shop steward from Cargill Meat Processing. Julian Levad, from a firm, international and regional organizer for United Teachers of Los Angeles. So after the speakers, at the end, we'll have questions and answers. So again, just a reminder, if you do have questions or comments for the speakers, at the bottom of the screen, there's a little chat. You can click on there and send your questions and comments to Rick, and he will forward them to me at the end. And then throughout the webinar, we're going to be doing polls. So with that being said, we'll start off with our first poll. It's going to come up on your screen, and you just have to click it, and I'll give you a minute to answer. The first question is, what is your affiliation, if any? So A, union member, B, labor activist, C, community activist, D, concerned individual, or E, other. And the second question is, what group do you most identify with? Asian, racialized ally, indigenous ally, white ally, or other? So I'll give you, there's 30 seconds left, so there's a timer on there. Great. You can answer those questions. And while you're answering, just a warning, I have 2 kids and you might see them pop up. Sorry. Okay, great. So we have a lot of union members. That's great. Concerned individuals. Then 54% Asian. And then our second is white ally. Great. Okay, so I'm gonna get started, and I don't know if I have to close this window. Or Jennifer, do you close this or do I do it? I'm going to close it. Okay. So I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Jennifer Mack, who is a member of ACLA, the Asian Canadian Labor Alliance, and has a background in human rights and equity, specializing in workplace harassment, discrimination, and violence prevention. Her areas of focus are workplace human rights investigations and diagnostics, and equity policy development and implementation. Jennifer will talk about the historical context of anti-Asian racism. Welcome, Jennifer.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for spending this hour and a half with us. So I guess first I really want to get into how it's really important to understand how and why Asian communities in Ontario and in Canada have become targets of racism, xenophobia, and hate crimes. When a disease is racialized, it's associated to a particular race or ethnicity, particularly non-white. purely on the basis of race, skin color, perceived cultural practices, racist stereotypes, etc. Consequently, that particular population becomes a target. So with COVID-19 being referred to as a Chinese virus or the China virus, it's one example of the disease being racialized. Further, it's also important to understand how the racialization of diseases can extend to and impact other groups beyond the target population. So in this case, Chinese population. In the case of COVID-19, although Chinese communities were originally a target group, because other Asian, racialized, and indigenous communities can be and are often perceived as Chinese or mistaken for Chinese, and or because Chinese are often seen as interchangeable with being Asian, as Asians are often perceived to be homogenous. The racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and hate crimes associated with COVID-19 have subsequently extended to other populations. There are severe long-term consequences to racializing diseases, which affects the lives and livelihoods of the target population. So as a result, in 2015, the World Health Organization came out with guidelines for naming new diseases, in which new diseases are not to be named using using scientific names, such as H1N1, and not named after geographical locations or people. Clearly, this has not been followed. So why is this happening in Canada? Well, this didn't happen overnight or come out of thin air, and really shouldn't come as a big surprise. From legislated racism and legislated racial discrimination, such as the Indian Act, the Residential School System, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the Japanese Internment, the Komogatu Maru Incident, the carding and racial profiling of Black communities, the Temporary Foreign Worker Program, just to name some, hate crimes such as the firebombing of the Hamilton Hindu Samaj Temple after 9/11, where the perpetrators confused a temple for a mosque, and to the current violent hate crimes against Asian communities. Canada has a long unspoken history of colonization, Canada being founded quote unquote, I should say, on the stolen land and genocide of Indigenous communities, in addition to slavery, oppression, racism, racial discrimination, etc., all of which continue on today. It's just that white supremacy and its systems of oppressions and inequities come in a slightly neater package, but the impacts are still the same. So as a result, racism is not a new thing to Canada. COVID-19 and the resulting anti-Asian and xenophobic rhetoric and fear-mongering merely triggered an upswing of the existing yellow peril, normalizing the anti-Asian racism and xenophobia, and legitimizing and justifying the hate crimes and violence against Asian and other impacted communities. The consequences of this latest wave of anti-Asian racism will be long-lasting and far-reaching, well after this pandemic is over. In addition to the threats of violence, there are and will continue to be repercussions that may not currently seem so obvious. For instance, how is this impacting and how will it impact an Asian person seeking medical care, renting or buying property? I'm sure you all remember the BC foreign buyers tax, getting a loan, getting a job, or running and maintaining a small business. So I'll leave you on some thoughts on some ways we can possibly move forward. As a starting point, we as a country need to stop deflecting, avoiding, and denying that racism and oppression in all its forms against Indigenous and racialized groups exist in Canada. I'm sure many of you have heard, oh, you know, it's not so bad here. Just be glad you don't live in XYZ country. Further, we need to stop hiding all of this under the guise of Canada being quote unquote polite and quote unquote being tolerant. Tolerance is really a term that goes against what anti-racism is. So really, we have to stop deflecting, avoiding, and denying all of this as a way to not have these conversations. So we really then need to strive to critically examine and interrogate what's going on in our own backyard at systemic, institutional, and individual levels, call it for what it is. So for example, we need to just call it racism because that's what it is. Call it out and acknowledge that these issues exist, for which we really can't continue to afford to be complacent and accept this as a norm. We can't begin to address any of these issues if we can't and don't acknowledge their existence and be open to having these conversations. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you so much. That was great. It's good to know some of the history, and we can keep a lot of those things in mind as we listen to our speakers as they share their stories and their experiences. Thank you, Jennifer. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Tony Wong. Tony has been a reporter at the Toronto Star, Canada's largest newspaper, for more than 30 years. Tony is currently a contributing columnist at the Star, but he previously was the newspaper's television and pop culture critic. Prior to that, he covered financial markets, economics, and technology, as well as politics at City Hall and Queen's Park. Tony's going to talk about his experience with anti-Asian racism, the W5, SARS, and COVID-19. Welcome, Tony.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and hello, everyone. Happy Asian Heritage Month. And yes, it is an honor to be Asian, so thank you, Sandra Oh. I'm wearing my Sandra Oh t-shirt today. I really appreciated hearing the historic perspective from Jennifer, because it's really an important benchmark, I think, to see where we are today. I'll give you maybe a tiny bit more history. My interest in journalism started decades ago because of the infamous W5 incident that some of you might remember. It turned out really to be a kind of a watershed moment for Asian Canadian activism. That's where CTV, which was still is Canada's largest broadcaster, did a report called Campus Giveaway. Back then they showed a video of Asian students on campus at the University of Toronto. But their big investigative report was that foreign students were taking over and blocking, real Canadians from attending professional schools like medicine and dentistry. The problem is the students they showed happened to be Canadians. It just never occurred to the journalists at Canada's largest broadcaster that people of Asian ethnicity could also be Canadian, which was, pretty mind-blowing. This was the start of a flashpoint in the community where we realized we really have to take control of our own narrative. That event certainly inspired me, but it also inspired a whole generation of journalists and activists in Canada. Now we fast forward to 40 years later, and it looks like the issue really hasn't gone away. We're still trying to desperately control our own narrative, and it seems after all this progress, some people still can't distinguish between the actions of a foreign government and Canadians who happen to be Asian, because Asians can't possibly be Canadian, right? That kind of thinking, of course, is what led to the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II. So it is with great dismay that today we have elected MPs in Canada wondering whether our top doctor, Theresa Tam, is loyal to Canada or is she loyal to China? It makes you wonder. Last week I was listening to New York Governor Andrew Cuomo saying that the virus entered New York via Italy. And that was reiterated by Dr. Anthony Fauci, the head of infectious diseases in the US. The two men are famous Italian Americans. But what if in some alternate universe, the disease had not just come from Italy, but also originated in Italy? Would their loyalty to the USA be questioned? Of course not. They're Americans, and that's how it should be. So I just want to make one thing clear. When we talk about anti-Asian racism, of course, we're also talking about anti-Chinese racism, except all Asians have been casualties here after being lumped into the great other, including Indigenous Canadians who are being attacked. The great irony is that some of them are being told to go back home. But that's the exact definition of racism. It affects everyone, and it affects all Asians and non-Asians because we are being blamed for something that's not your fault. Nobody, of course, would consider the French or the Germans or the Swiss to be anything but distinct societies. So the pandemic has resurrected biases that never really went away, but we thought we had already come so far, right? You know, COVID-19 is happening at a crucial inflection point, because finally, as Asians, we thought we were having a moment, we're catching a break. We were coming off the high of the first Hollywood movie in 25 years with an all Asian cast. Next year, we'll be having the first Asian Marvel superhero, and he's from Toronto, of all places. We even had to sue Harvard. Why? Because they weren't letting enough Asians in. And on Canada's national broadcaster, the CBC, we have not one, but 2 Asian anchors, which was unthinkable when I was growing up. Now, all those gains seem a generation away. Racists are far more emboldened. You have divisive rhetoric from the most powerful leader in the free world. And there are propaganda and hate campaigns that are broadcast in a social media ecosystem that simply didn't exist before. From a labor perspective, Asians are hit with a double whammy of higher unemployment and racism. If you are female, where many have been impacted disproportionately, it's an additional burden. So given all this, the solution, of course, is complex, but I would also argue that it's actually quite simple. Because no matter your situation, hate and ignorance affects all of us. Racism is racism is racism. So what does this mean in practical terms? Well, Donald Trump was right about one thing. Sunlight is the best disinfectant because racism thrives in ignorance. So I suggest we have to develop a herd immunity against racism. The more people who are informed about the problem, the more we are empowered. But what can you do on an individual level, right? Well, first of all, we have to know the scope of the problem. We have to document the cases. And you'll hear more about this, for example, from Justin Kong of CCNC later in this talk. I know this can be hard reporting. I grew up personally being told to turn the other cheek. I was always reminded that the nail that sticks up gets hammered down. My parents were of the generation that survived by being invisible. But that's no longer an option, because if we don't stand up for ourselves to be counted, who will? The second step is education. We have to take control of our own narrative, as we learned from W5, but we must amplify that voice. And the third step is prosecution. Assaults and hate crimes are crimes, and we have to educate lawmakers, legislators, and police that this should not be tolerated. They need to be taking this a lot more seriously. There simply is no excuse. And finally, we respond by taking ownership. We all have to stand up to racism when we see it. Not just Asians, not just people of color, but all Canadians. And that goes for all forms of racism, whether it's anti-Semitism, anti-Black, anti-Muslim, anti-Aboriginal, or homophobia. We must denounce all forms of hatred. In practical terms, this could mean standing up for the person who got yelled at in the grocery store. It could mean lending your voice to an online post if you see someone getting bullied through social media. Or it could simply mean acknowledging to yourself that a problem exists, because collective voices matter. I do want to make one thing clear though, intervene only if you feel it's safe to do so. No victim of racism is expecting you to put yourself in harm's way. But one of the most traumatizing things for any victim is when they don't feel supported or heard. None of this is easy. Again, it takes courage, but silence and complacency is not an option. Anti-Muslim racism was normalized after 9/11 because too few voices fight. How we all respond is the litmus test for Canadians. And I have confidence, especially in our younger generation that is more connected. They're smarter, they're more outspoken. And today, many more Asian Canadians are in positions of power politically, in business, and in media than ever before. But we need all your voices. So thank you for listening, and I'm really interested in hearing about your experiences and your questions.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you for sharing the historical, what's happened to us historically and the racism that's occurred and how it's continued. I think something that, oh, the poll came up, sorry. Have you experienced or witnessed anti-Asian racism during the pandemic? So you have a minute to complete the poll. Yes, I've experienced it. Yes, I've witnessed or know someone who's experienced it. No, I haven't experienced or know anyone who's experienced it. So I'll give you 1 minute to complete the poll. Okay, so I can see that majority of the people here have witnessed or know someone who's experienced it. And I think it really depends on who we are and where we are located, really, because I mean, during the pandemic, I know I haven't left the house, so my experience would be different. But just going back to what Tony said, I think it's so important that we do recognize what's happening, and something that you mentioned about, you know, parents being silent. I know from my own parents and my own experience, it's, you know, my parents obviously experienced it, but their response was always, you know, be quiet, work harder. And that's what I was taught. But it's what Tony said was like, right now, this is not the time. We need to stand up and speak out against what's happening, because we can't allow this to continue, because it's just going to continue happening to the next generation. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Justin Kong, who is a community and labor organizer in Toronto. He is the executive director of the Chinese Canadian National Council Toronto chapter and a member of the Toronto and York Region Chinese Workers Network. And Justin is going to outline the response of the Asian community to racism and how our response should differ now. Welcome, Justin.
Hi, everyone. So glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, it's so nice to be here with amazing group of activists and organizers. Thank you to the folks at ACLA, at CWN, for hosting this and inviting me. I've worked with many of you and have learned a lot from all of you, right? In my role as an organizer. So I work at the CCNC Toronto, and recently we launched our website to track racism, right? So this is a project in collaboration with a few other Chinese Canadian organizations. It's federally funded project to track racism and track instances of anti-Asian racism that has emerged during COVID-19. So we officially launched this website today, and as you can see from the website here, it has you can record an incident of racism. You can check out the map, and you can check out a timeline, right? So it kind of shows us an overview of some of the things that are going on. So this is a tool, right? I think this is a tool to verify, to show a lot of people that it's like, hey, there's racism going on. What does it actually look like, right? I think in our experiences, many of us live it, but then making sure that people know about it and making sure that people can share the experiences is really important. Not only on like an advocacy level, but just generally, right? In order for us to, and that's part of how racism works, right? Like when racialized people's experiences are denied and rejected, right? At the same time, I think beyond the tracking website that we're doing, right? A lot of our work at CCNC Toronto is based around working with Chinese Canadian workers, often folks who aren't unionized, right? Folks who are in precarious jobs, like grocery store workers, like PSWs. And so that's the groups that we work with and engage with. And so during the pandemic, part of our work has been supporting these workers, making sure that, you know, they're able to access the income supports, making sure they have like protective equipment, like masks and stuff for frontline workers who work in, you know, PSW or like grocery stores. So that's been part of our work. And in addition to that, it's often working with folks who don't have unions, right? And so the recognition is that in order to actually fight racism, I think what we have to do as a community and as a society is to recognize how racism is built into like systems of oppression, like capitalism and colonialism and imperialism, right? And so I think what's really important now in the world of COVID-19 is recognizing how we're seeing like, essentially the largest transfer of wealth like in history, right? In the United States, I think something like 40 million people lost their jobs, despite that billionaire class has, 20% increased their wealth. Near the neighborhood where I grew up in Scarborough, we recently got an Amazon center. And so that just shows you how like wealth is concentrating, right? Jeff Bezos is slated to be the first trillionaire, right? While more and more people have nothing, right? So I think in answering the question, like how do we fight anti-Asian racism? How do we fight anti-Black racism as it intensifies both here in Toronto and the United States? I think the answer to that is how do we build a left that is powerful enough and capable of bringing together different communities of color, different working class community, different poor and marginalized communities, right? To fight back against this landscape of austerity that we're staring down in the aftermath of COVID-19, right? I think for me, like, I think that's a lot of what I think about as an activist and as a labor organizer. So, and I think I think a lot of the speakers previously have made really good points about how people are gonna try to scapegoat like the Chinese or other people for this virus, right? We saw it after 9/11. After every time there's a crisis, that's what the ruling and political elites wanna do. They wanna scapegoat. They wanna make this about, this group who's harmed us, right? But we know that's not the case, right? So I think my urge then is like, and it's good to be here in the House of Labor where, there's all these amazing union organizers and folks. I think the question is like, how do we continue to build, right? How do we continue to build power in working class racialized communities, right? And so I want to shout out what amazing work CWN has done as well, right? I think over the years, I've been a member for a few years now, and just the folks there have been amazing, right? Like Jennifer, Kingsley, and the rest of the folks just organizing in CWN has been absolutely great, right? So I think we got to keep building, right? We got to keep building power in our communities. We got to keep thinking about ways in which we can, fight not only in our workplaces, but in society at large, right? How do we increase like worker power in our workplaces, right? How do we build a movement, and how do we build our communities that are able to actually fight back, right? Because I think we're in for a landscape of fighting, right? And I think as things get worse and worse, right? I think we're staring down austerity, right? So yeah, I hope we can have more of a conversation about how we can do this. I know there's a lot of really like amazing organizers here, and yeah, I think it's just good to like start thinking about this and preparing, right? I think I'm very scared, right? I'm scared that that this virus is going to be used to scapegoat like our communities, right? But I think the only real way out is building power amongst like racialized communities and amongst workers, right? And so to do that, we got to build our institutions. We got to build our organizations, right? I think there's a great quote, and it's like unions and workers' organizations are training grounds for workers, right? It's where we train to fight and where we train to one day govern, right? To govern ourselves, right? And I think that really, in some ways, exemplifies to me some of the like best work in like labor that's going on is, right now, like in this landscape, how do we do that, right? And how do we not allow the elites to divide us and instill like divide and conquer into our communities? Yeah, so with that, I want to leave it there, and thank you again. Looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Justin. I think you made some really important points regarding our labor movement and the community. And I think that is so important, especially here on the call. We know we have a lot of labor activists on here. And there is this need to further our actions and build solidarity between the labor movement and our community. We know that our communities, there's a lot of grassroots organizations that are doing the work, that have been doing the work, and it's important that our labor movement stands behind them and support that the work that they're doing so that we can fight what's happening right now. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, Elaine Lamb, who is the Executive Director of Butterfly, the Asian and Migrant Sex Workers Support Network. She has been involved in sex workers, labor, migrant, gender, and racial justice movements for over 20 years. She is a PhD candidate at McMaster University, and Elaine is going to outline the challenges faced by marginalized workers. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this important meeting to bring people together, and really great to hear all the speakers talk about like how racism affect the Asian community and how we need to come together to fight against it. So, and I am so glad that when ACLA organized this event and also other co-organizer is also include sex work in the conversation, because sex work is often not being recognized as work. When people talk about labor rights, is always being excluded. So that is something really appreciate the organizer, including Butterfly, in this conversation. So I think I will use what we found the struggle of the worker during the COVID to show how the system is so problematic. So because COVID really reflect the crack of the social system, so reflect how racism, classism is keep operating, that make people become more vulnerable. And in COVID, we can see so clearly. So migrant sex worker and workers work in massage parlor is similar to many other Asian workers. Because of the racism, they may need to work in very precarious work. So when COVID hit, as other speakers say, is the community being hurt a lot. But when the government introduced the economic relief, they are being excluded. The workers has been always excluded from the workers' protection, but even this crisis, so they are not able to get any support. So for example, Butterfly have done a survey with over 100 of workers. So over 40% of the worker is not able to get served or other kind of like labor protection and like economic relief. So they are still they already struggling with the poverty every day, but in the COVID, they really cannot get anything. They are being left behind because of the immigration status, because the precarious of work, and the other part, as a sex worker and also people work in massage parlor, because this industry is being criminalized and always being targeted by law enforcement. So even some workers, they may able to apply to serve, but they don't want to do it. So it's really, really great impact. And the other thing is we also have a lot of self-employed worker as a small business owner. So they are the worker, but they are also like the small business owner themselves. So they also cannot get any government relief. So that is very clearly how racism operate, that to make racialized precarious worker being pushed out from the protective system. So income support is the huge concern of the worker. So, and the other part is what we see as other speaker already mentioned about racism. So that is also in our research, many workers in the phone call, that is also worried them a lot. But the racism is not only day to day by the people contact, but we also see the government use COVID as the opportunity to increase the power to racial profile migrants, particularly those don't have immigration status or have precarious immigration status. Of course, Asian is as a racialized group, they are also being targeted. So during the COVID, so for example, Ontario has imposed few like different emergency order. So the emergency order has increased the power of the law enforcement, that they increase the surveillance racial profile, but at the same time, so for example, they also allow to do the ID check. So who are the people being targeted? So we have some member in Chinatown, they say, I'm afraid to go out. Why? Because they see two girls just sitting together, walking together very closely. They do not isolate 2 meters, they got a ticket. But what we see, so when so many white folks gather in the park, that who is being targeted, right? So like how the law, who are the people often being targeted, and COVID also continues, this community is being continuous using the law, being surveillance and also being punished, right? So when people precarious, many of the member also, they are homeless. They don't have the home to stay, right? When they cannot stay home, when they get outside to get information or resources or even food or supply, then they will get a ticket because of violating the social isolation law. But that is the punishment of the precarious, the punishment of the poor, the punishment is also come from who is the law enforcement tracing, of course, is like racialized people, and Asian is also the people being targeted. So, and this COVID really make people frustrated, but I think this is also the opportunity that people can use this moment to do organizing. So, and for Butterfly, so that we have people with different immigration status, the people may do different kind of service, but the COVID created opportunity, people come together, just like Justin said. So how we need to mobilize the community to build the power, and also having opportunity to understand and also work together to see the injustice of the system. Because I think one of the greatest way to oppress is make the people don't realize that we are living with this oppression, we are living with this racism, right? And as a very, thank you for the opening statement. So Indigenous and migrant always like being divided to maintain the white supremacy, to maintain the white people power, and then how we take the opportunity can learn from each other. So so that's why I think this is important to take this moment, how we can look at how the system is so unfair for many workers, and how the worker can participate to advocate together. So, and for the income part, many workers are being excluded. They cannot get anything. Many workers still need to survive. They need to continues to work and cannot get any supply, but at the same time they are also being blamed. So and instead of looking at individually, so and I think having the opportunity to look at how different Asian community, people from different industry is being affected, and how to do the work together, I think that is something very important in our work. So that maybe later can share a little bit more. So but the level of the policing is really huge. So for example, we have a worker, she tried to protect herself by isolate herself to stay in the workplace at daytime, because she has parents, they are old. So, but because massage parlor is the place always being targeted by law enforcement always going to harass the worker. In COVID, it's not stopped. So the first day, the worker was given a ticket to fine. She was staying there, even she don't operate the business. On the other day, the law enforcement come back again and give her 5 tickets in one day. So it's not only standard $1,000, she can get $50,000 fine when she went to the court. So who can afford to hire the lawyer, right? Not the precarious worker. So who can run away from that type of law enforcement? It's not racialized, it's not Asian people. So I think this is a very strong illustration to see the people already suffering from income loss. They are not able to get any government support. on the other hand, the increasing of policing surveillance do not stop with the COVID, but because of creating Asian as a dangerous, as a threat, is give the excuse for law enforcement, even increase the power, increase the surveillance to make the people more unsafe. And we don't see police can make people safe. Police is not the system really make people healthy. So, and how our community can build the power to resist that and take away that illusion that law enforcement is come to help us. But rather, so there is a lot of wisdom. So for example, Asian community is the first community promoting using masks, but that is being used at the beginning, attack and impose a lot of racism. So, and how we can continue to build the wisdom of the community and to resist like those institution power and also the white power. I think that is something I hope we can do together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing those stories with us and those important points. And I do hope that, you know, we will be able to discuss some of the actions, and maybe in a further webinar, we can do more. I don't want to take up too much time because I know we have a couple more speakers. So just a quick reminder, if you do have questions, please click on the chat box at the bottom of your screen, and then also just mention who your question is directed to, so Rick knows when he sends me the questions. So I'm going to keep moving along. Our next speaker who is Alain Mendoza, who is a UFCW member and works at Cargill Meat Processing in High River, Alberta. He has been employed there since 2008. Alain came to Canada from the Philippines with his family looking for a better life, and he has been a shop steward for 2 years and has spoken out about how COVID-19 is impacting his workplace and community. Alain is going to be discussing the situation at Cargill and what the union's response is in the racism faced by the Filipino community in High River. Welcome, Alain.
Hi, yeah, good evening. Well, as you all know, I came from the Philippines, and what I've heard about the topic, mostly about like the first one is the history type. Well, I can say that it is tenaciously part of the human to become like being arrogant. I mean, in terms of racism, especially those who rise in power usually tend to become racist in a long process. And yeah, I do believe with it. And I don't want to mention it, but probably because I saw a lot of us here are Asian. My great-grandfather came from Xiamen, China. Before they call it Amoy, China. So yeah, I came here to search for a greener pasture, and I love Canada, of course. It gives me the great opportunity, and for my stay here, I haven't been treated like what do you call this, racial discrimination, as they say. But things changed during COVID period. I saw a lot of things that I cannot imagine it's happening right now. Well, you all heard about there are more than 950 employees in Cargill has been affected by the COVID-19, like positively. And they are also linked for more than 600 plus outside of Cargill, affecting some people. And the largest incident of outbreak inside Canada. We all know that. But what we didn't see is what happened during March, third week of March, like there are rumors already that there are some or a few people got infected by the COVID, but the company hide it. The union tried to ask to get the information, but they concealed it to us. They never talk about it, as if never. So what happened next? The only way we can do is ask the company to provide us a proper PPE against COVID, like a simple face mask, surgical mask, face shield, and a temperature check outside of Cargill before you can enter so that you will know if you have a fever or not. And a shield, like shield in every part of us because we work shoulder to shoulder. Like, how can I explain it to you? It's very difficult because, as you all know, Cargill is a huge company and a huge plant. But we are like more than 2,200 employees, day shift and night shift both. And well, I can say that maybe when we ask them, they ignore us because they thought that we're Superman, we're immune to virus. Or maybe they thought they're just an immigrant. They don't work any single loony. That's a possibility because they didn't even provide us with that proper PPE that we're asking for it. No, like if you can imagine how big is the company or the plant is inside, it really gets shrunk when all those employees are inside. Cargill was designed not to be as having a social distance, physically distance to each other. We're doing 2,500 in carcasses in 8 hours, or about almost 5,000 in both ship. How can we possibly do the physical distance? It's impossible. The locker is very congested. The cafeteria is like, it become midget. We're pull back like a can of sardines. And they don't care about us. Well, why? Because let's say a chunk of those employees are Filipino workers. Probably 70% are Filipinos. And all employees of Cargill workforce are all immigrants. Maybe if it is a Canadian, they might change their mind. But no, because we're Asians, like we are dispensable to them. So the union tried to communicate, but they block it. And we turn to media. And media is a very powerful tool. When we did that, people starting asking what happened. How come that Cargill are not doing anything? And of course, the pressure is on them, the company. So they start opening up, like they said, we have 39. So from 1 to 39, in a matter of few days, we have more than 540. Then politics intertwined with business. Alberta Health System, they said, Cargill is safe for work. It is one of the safest place to work with. How can you say that if there are more than 3,500 employees got already for positive? So to turn it out, maybe because Cargill are probably paying, Cargill are one of the biggest contributor of tax in Alberta. And they said that we are essentially needed because we put foods on the table of Canadian. Yeah, but in what sense that our lives was being put to risk? It's hard. So when someone died, they just said, okay, we will gonna shut down. Imagine we're asking that for 2 weeks already, and they didn't even like heard us saying that. 2 weeks. That 2 weeks that we're asking, if they did that earlier, there shouldn't be like 900 employees got positive. No one should be sacrificing their lives for the sake of food of every Canadian tables. If they did that earlier, people can be quarantined for that 14 days and they can deep clean the company, the plant itself. But because of greed, because of money, because of politics, they don't care about us. We're an immigrant, Asian immigrants especially. So who do they care? Of course, they're all brothers, brothers in crime, probably we can say that. And, you know, as I said before, the media, it also become a tool against discrimination. I mean, a tool for discrimination. When people find out about the outbreak, now people are being afraid that if you are a Filipino, if you are an Asian, and you are working in Cargill, they know, even you are negative, they will just thought that you are a positive person of COVID. So people like Filipinos experiencing that in the grocery store, when you go to the grocery store, like the stare of every person on you from your foot to head to foot, like they are afraid, like you're a walking virus. And people, Filipino and Asian, are being turned down to the bank. They are not letting us go inside, and like that. And yeah, and what happened next? We asked, what should we do about it? Well, the only one of the solution is Canada is a diverse country. Maybe if we educate, if education is one of the key. I mean, not totally education as per se, because some of our education is obsolete. But the ignorance can be cured by education, proper education. Our history, our cultures, our traditions, all of the Malays, if they just can accept us, who we are. After all, what Canada is for. Canada is composed of multi-diverse people. So, yeah, I guess that's it.
Thank you, Alain. Thank you for sharing what's happening in that workplace. I think a lot of times we only hear what the news and social media allows us to know, and it's so important to hear from the workers themselves and the actions that you guys took to make those necessary changes. And you're right, education is so important, because there's no way we can change what's happening without learning our history and unlearning some of the things that we were taught here growing up. So thank you, and I'm gonna continue on to the next speaker. Also, don't forget your little chat box at the bottom if you have comments or questions. Our next speaker is Julian Levad, who is the founding chairperson of AFFIRM, an anti-imperialist transnational feminist organization for women of color, and has been a part of the organization for 17 years, currently serving on AFFIRM's international committee. Jollene is a regional organizer for United Teachers Los Angeles, the second largest teachers union in the United States, which went on strike and won in January of 2019. She has worked with unions in Canada, sharing her experience and analysis on how to organize and fight back. Welcome, Jollene.
Thank you. Let's see, may I have the slides, please? Thank you, Anna. All right. Good afternoon and good evening, everybody. Again, I'm Jolene, and I'm going to start by talking about Affirm's organizing and then move into the union organizing. So we in Affirm practice transnational feminism, which means we organize deeply where we reside and then horizontally across borders. We have 3 campaign areas: one against trafficking of women and children, one for immigrant and migrant women's rights, and the last one is against militarism in all its forms, including the police occupation of our communities. And when I say that we organize across borders, this also includes imperialist ones. What I mean is, for example, our Affirm Puerto Rico chapter is organizing right now for just basic survival and supplies. In Hawaii, another US colony, our Affirm chapter has been pushing the first and foremost feminist recovery plan in the nation, and fighting against rent pimps and the threat that this economic destabilization, which previous speakers had talked about, have on women of color, particularly Indigenous, Black, API, and then working class and working poor women. So mutual aid has been set up in both of our locations, particularly for women who are at risk of re-entering the sex trade because of poverty, because they have no other choice. This mirrors our work in Affirm New York, who's a part of the Equality Model Coalition and set up the same mutual aid. What you see in front of you is the type of organizing we're doing here on Tongva land in Los Angeles, where I am based. Here in LA, we focus a lot of our attention on undocumented women's needs, which are our members' needs. The local and federal governments, they can't seem to provide proper protective equipment for healthcare workers and other essential workers, but they somehow found enough masks for ICE so that ICE can continue to detain and deport our communities. So what you see in front of you is we've joined car protests in front of the in support of women food vendors. And again, our leadership has participated in multiple panels offering resources for undocumented people to access. The borders are imposed on our bodies, and we carry them wherever we reside. So our transnational work has to be ongoing, it has to be multifaceted, and frankly, it has to be relentless. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, I actually shortened some of my presentation because I stayed up last night and I felt like I really needed to add this slide. Just last night, Affirm Los Angeles answered Black Lives Matter Los Angeles' call and mobilized in downtown LA, shutting down our main freeway and protesting at the district attorney's office, as well as the ICE detention center, which is currently holding undocumented people, not criminals. It's important to note that in Affirm, we believe that standing against anti-Asian racism means also answering the call to action to stand against anti-Blackness and anti-Black racism. George Floyd was murdered across the country in Minnesota on Tuesday, May 26th, and an Asian American police officer stood guard while 4 white cops killed Floyd. It's just unacceptable. Our fight against anti-Asian racism has to also be about confronting xenophobia in our own communities, right? And within our communities, we can talk about that. We can talk about the fact that we are a diverse umbrella of communities, and we have to talk about xenophobia that we experience amongst and between our Asian American or API communities. And then in addition to that, we can't in no way accept or stand by as people murder and commit genocide against Black communities. May I have the next slide, please? The last aspect of our Affirm work that I wanted to share is this, what you see in front of you. The Affirm Transnational Committee, which I'm a member of, created a digital wall and a memorial for transnational healthcare workers of Philippine ancestry, Filipino descent, which make up a disproportionate amount of the global healthcare workforce due to the labor export policies of the Philippines. Like Alain just actually talked about that a little bit, right? And so I included the statistic for Canada, as well as where I reside in California. And so what we did was we, one by one, found as much as we could from raw data, the names of all the healthcare workers that have died across the globe, and created this digital wall. It's data that people can access and use for their own organizing. I want to also uplift Victoria Salvan from Montreal, Warlito Valdez from Richmond, and Christine Mandegarian from Toronto, who have passed away while being healthcare workers and caring for the sick in Canada. We did this, and we're talking about anti-Asian racism, while my mother continues to expose herself because she is a registered nurse here in Los Angeles treating patients, while my mother-in-law treats patients, while my sisters-in-law work in the ICU treating positive COVID patients, my aunts, my late grandmother. What our website aims to do is to do what no governments around the world are doing properly, which is not just honoring, but at least naming the dead. If we're going to talk about worker justice, we have to know the names and faces of those that are being treated as disposable during the pandemic. May I have the last slide, please? Okay, so finally, as a transnational woman of color and a United Teachers Los Angeles union organizer, I have to say that fighting against anti-racism has to be built into absolutely everything we do, everything. Our union has been publicly, explicitly anti-racist, and groups like Black Lives Matter Los Angeles and organizations that fight for, with, as undocumented immigrants are actually at our tables. They have actually been there with us as we write our drafts for our union contracts. That shouldn't be revolutionary. If we're talking about anti-racism, then we have to have all the players at the table. I come from a union with 34,000 members, 70% of them are women, and the largest number are actually Latina. Our students, 73% are Latino, 10% are white, 8% Black, 4% Asian, and 2% Filipino. So if that's where we live, how can we as a union aspire towards worker liberation when our families, our kids that go to Los Angeles schools are being targeted by ICE and the police? We have to be anti-racist. Our union is gearing up to refuse every and all budget cuts on the backs of our students and educators. This is what you see in front of you. We're gearing up to fight to tax corporations in California and put those billions of dollars into education and health services. That's anti-racist. We're working with education unions across California to sign this petition. And the third demand on our petition is that we demand healthcare for all, income replacement for those affected by the pandemic, paid medical leave for all workers, fair housing policies. Our students and our families deserve the basics, and that is anti-racist, right? We see that the economy is working for workers, and guess what? In LA, that means it's not working for workers, and guess what? That means there are people of color here in Los Angeles. Class is racialized, and race determines where you are in this class society. So if we're gonna actually win freedom, real freedom, then we have to be anti-racist. And I mean that for all people. I mean that lifting up those that are particularly and violently killed, women, Black, Indigenous, Latinos, APIs, and the queer community. And I mean that as trade unionists, we can't settle for anything less. We're at the precipice of a new society, a new world. After the pandemic, will we once again allow capitalism to rebuild itself off of our backs? Or will we create a collective vision, a new world, and fight like hell to make sure it's realized? That's our task. That is our main task as freedom-loving people, as feminists, as anti-racist organizers, and as trade unionists at this time. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolene. That was very powerful. Thank you so much. I know we have a lot of questions come in. There's a poll up, but I'm gonna let you do the poll and I'm gonna just keep talking. So I'll read the poll question first. In your opinion, is the union movement doing enough to respond to the rise in anti-Asian racism? So I'll let you guys do the poll, but I'm gonna keep going just because we only have a few minutes and I know there's a lot of questions that came in. And so I'm going to, I think we only have time for maybe one question. I am so sorry. So I'm going to grab the question. I'm sorry. Question for Justin. It's important that you and others have developed this reporting tool. How long will this tool be used? With whom will you share the data? For example, the police, community, elected representatives. How important is it to document these incidences of anti-Asian, and how can we best mobilize the public, activists, and publicize the issues with the government? I'm so sorry. I can only ask one question. It's going to you. I think you might be on mute, Justin.
Hello?
You're good.
Hello?
I can hear you. I don't know if, okay.
Hi.
Yep, I can hear you.
Sorry about that. I don't know what was going on.
Liz, could we ask the next question to Tony, since Justin's experiencing some technical difficulties, and maybe Tony can answer that while Justin works on technology?
Yeah. Okay, Tony. Identifying and naming racism is important. Standing with a victim of xenophobia is empowering. Is there any bystander training you would recommend for us, or is there best practices we can do to stand with victims of xenophobia, racism, and xenophobia?
For sure, great question. You know, the caveat, of course, is always make sure that you're safe. And but one thing, and we've seen it so powerfully, especially recently in Minneapolis, is document what's happening. If you feel safe and you can whip out your video camera, document that evidence, help somebody else. I think that's so key. The earlier question was asking Justin about how that, and if I can answer for him a little bit, I know he's kind of stuck on the audio there. The CCNC Toronto chapter got a grant from Heritage Canada through CCNC SJ, which is their parent organization, and they're looking at a pretty comprehensive set of tools that will try and document what's happening across Canada. Now there's more than one organization doing this, and unfortunately they're a little bit fragmented, but hopefully we can have some kind of national consensus, and I think the CCNC is one of those ways to go. The second issue is to get good documentation and good data, and they're still trying to figure that out. And with good data, then you can have good policy. I think that's the second thing. I don't know if Justin's back, but
yeah, hi. Hi, can you, sorry about that. I was just having some issues with my my technology. So yeah, thank you for asking that question. I think just to clarify, CC and CSJ is we're like a collaborative organization, so it's not a parent organization. So we work together, and so they applied for the funding and have asked us to help out with the work. So yeah, I think in terms of how the information is being shared, I think for racialized people, I think one of the biggest issues is obviously just recognizing that racism exists is a huge challenge, right? I think we see that throughout the years, right? So the tool and the data collected from the tool will demonstrate the severity of the issue and that it's happening, right? It's evidence that it's happening, right? And so I think there's conversations going on, I think, in the community around how we'll use the data, and we're still having those conversations, right? Whether or not views on the police, right, which is super tricky and super complicated, right? I think but I think in general, we're seeing the police hasn't been helping out racialized communities, right? They haven't been doing that, right? So even recognizing that, I think is important, right? The violence, the state violence through the police that we see in both in Canada and the United States. So yeah, I think how do we mobilize? I think we obviously we make our voices heard, and obviously I think we need to be working together with other racialized communities who also face racism, and oftentimes much more violent forms of racism, right? So I think building those solidarities, which have always been there historically, right? But renewing ourselves to that commitment to build, I think, is super important now more than ever.
Great. Thank you so much. I know we only have 2 minutes left, so you have your last poll up on the screen. Are you interested in getting involved to fight racism? Are you interested in participating in future webinars like this? So hopefully by answering these questions, it gives us, I can already see the results. So I'm gonna do a quick wrap up because I have literally 2 minutes left. I want to thank everyone for participating in this. I want to thank our amazing speakers and our organizations for putting this together. So in closing, I just want to say that we cannot be silenced by the fear of this ongoing racism, and that it is up to each and every one of us, and it's our responsibility to stop this. And just because it's May and it's Asian Heritage Month, it does not mean that we stop talking about this. It doesn't mean that the racism stops. We do have the power and we have the responsibility to make sure that we all feel a sense of belonging and a responsibility to our community and our kids to make sure that we all are safe. And that starts with us supporting each other and being vocal about what's happening. And we all need to stop turning a blind eye to what's happening out there. And if you see something, say something. And I just want to thank everyone today for having this discussion. Hopefully we'll have more of these planned. Thank you and have a good night.